Nick, thank you, and I'd like to thank Jim Madlack and the Camden Board of Directors for inviting me. You know, when I got this invitation, I mentioned it to my wife, and my wife said, but that's in February. She said, you know, we normally spend the winter in Maui. And I said, yeah, but these seem like nice people in Maine. She said, Clyde, who goes from Maui to Maine in February? I said, well, I guess I do. So it's nice to be here with you. And actually, it's not very cold. So our topic, well, do we have what it takes, raises the obvious question of takes to do what? And Nick actually suggested several of the whats. One of them is geopolitical power. One of them kind of soft power. One of them is economic power. And I could not agree more with Nick that the most important element is economic power. Because without that, nothing else can be done. And so to me, the question is, do we have what it takes to right our economy and to maintain our economy as a competitive economy in a global, much increasingly globally competitive economy? And do we have what it takes to have the economic backing for all of these other priorities that we have? Let me give you the answer right up front. The answer is yes, we do have what it takes. But that's not necessarily a dispositive answer. I'm sure many of you play bridge. You know that you can have a good hand. You can have a lot of high cards. You can still lose if you play the cards badly. I do it all the time. We have good cards. You know, if you think of the game of globalization as a game of bridge, and ask yourself, whose hand would you like to play? The EU hand, the Japanese hand, the Chinese hand, the American hand? I take the American hand. Mind you, our cards are not as good today as they were 10 years ago, not as good as they were 20 years ago, but they're still good. The question is, how do we play the hand? And in thinking about that question, one of the big elements is in producing wealth in the global economy, in competing in the global economy with China, with Germany, with Brazil. What are the key things that we have to be looking at? So one of the things I do is I just look at the numbers. And the number for in 2011 was that the United States had what's called a current account deficit. Think of it as the trade deficit, it's simpler that way, of almost $600 billion, about 3.2% of GDP. Most economists would agree that a current account trade deficit of 3% or above of GDP is not sustainable long term. The US has been at about 3% or more for the last 6 or 7 years. So we're on an unsustainable track in our global competitiveness, at least measured by the trade deficit. Now, if you look at that trade deficit and break it down, and you say, well, what makes up the trade deficit? There are two key elements. One is trade in goods, and the other is trade in services. The United States actually has a trade surplus in services. So what are services? Well, banking services, consulting services, travel. People who come to Maine from Europe, for example, are a services export. We're exporting travel to those Europeans, let's say, who come here to Maine from Europe. We have a surplus in services, but it's not a big surplus. Our surplus in services is about $200 billion. That means that we have a deficit in goods of about $800 billion. And of that $800 billion, about $600 billion of it is in manufactured goods. The other 200 billion is agricultural goods and mineral oils and stuff like that. But manufactured goods is the overwhelmingly biggest piece of the trade deficit. And so if you just look at the magnitude of the numbers, yes, we can increase our services exports, but are we likely to triple them in the next 10 years? I think the answer is no. And we've gotten a huge gift from technology and from nature in that because of the new technology of fracking shale gas and shale oil, our imports of oil are actually declining, and we look to be on the way to a high degree of self-sufficiency, at least in carbon fuels. So that will help our trade deficit, but it will still not compensate for the 600 billion in manufactured goods. Now, I remember as a boy, this is just a little coincidence, but I'm from Wilmington, Delaware, same as Governor DuPont. I was one of his constituents. And as a boy, my dad worked in Philadelphia. And so Dad would commute back and forth from Wilmington to Philadelphia every day. And sometimes he'd ask me to get on the train and come up to Philly to meet him. And we'd go to a ball game, or we'd go to the Franklin Institute, or do something fun together. Now, as you travel on the train from Wilmington to Philadelphia, you go through the town of Chester, Pennsylvania. And I remember that when I was doing that back in the 50s, as you came into the train station in Chester, there was a sign, a big sign, over the train station. And it said, "What Chester makes Chester." Now, in those days, what did Chester make? They made ships, they made locomotives, they made turbines, they made all kinds of stuff. Pianos. They had Baldwin Piano Company. They made pianos in Chester, Pennsylvania. And Chester was a booming place. I used to love to go through it because, you know, factories and smokestacks and so forth. It was really interesting. Go to Chester today. It's a sad story because they don't make anything. Unemployment's about 50%. Town's totally falling apart. High crime rates, high drug rates. Chester doesn't make anything. So I use that as a bit of a metaphor for the United States. Just ask yourself, what does the United States make? Manufacturing in the United States as a percent of GDP is less than 10%. That's less than even Great Britain. Great Britain's about 11%. Germany's about 18%. Japan's about 20%. Korea's 30%. China's about 40%. Very, very low percentage of GDP for US manufacturing. So how does this happen, and what can we do about it, I think is one of maybe the most important question facing us as a nation. Now, let me tell you a little story that I think will, in a way, illustrate how we got here and how we need to think about getting out. This is a story about a hiker in California. He was arrested, thrown in jail for killing and eating a California condor. Now, you know a condor is a rare bird. It's protected. You're not supposed to kill them. You're not supposed to eat them. So came time for the trial. It looked like an open and shut case because the guy admitted that he had killed and eaten the condor. Prosecutor threw the book at him, demanded life imprisonment. The judge turned to the hiker after the prosecutor had finished and said, "Well, you know, looks kind of bad for you, but do you have anything to say for yourself?" The hiker said, "Well, as a matter of fact, Judge, I do." He said, "Look, there were extenuating circumstances. I had been hiking for 3 days and 3 nights without food or water. I was just at the point of exhaustion. I happened to see this bird sitting on a rock. I picked up a stone, threw it, killed it, ate it. I hiked for 3 more days and 3 more nights without food or water before reaching civilization. If I hadn't killed and eaten that bird, you wouldn't be able to sentence me here today. So the judge was impressed. He said, yes, those were extenuating circumstances. And in view of that, he would issue a suspended sentence. But don't do it anymore. So the hiker thanked him, began to leave the courtroom, and just as he was about to go out the door, the judge called to him. The judge said, by the way, what did that condor taste like? Hiker paused for a moment. He said, well, be honest with you, Judge. It was kind of between a bald eagle and a spotted owl. So the hiker and the judge were obviously on different wavelengths, whole different philosophy of life. Now, let me go from there and tell you another story. A few months ago, there was a story in the business section of the papers announcing that Intel had opened a new Pentium chip plant in Dalian, China. Now, Pentium chip, this is the microprocessor that powers all of your laptop computers. Intel makes about 85% of those microprocessors that power all of the laptops in the world. Intel has 85% global market share in making those chips. Intel makes about 80% of those in New Mexico and Arizona, where they have their major manufacturing locations. Let me just add by way of credentials on this. I, for a long time, was on Intel's advisory board, so I do know the company somewhat. Now, you know that we have a big trade deficit with China. Our trade deficit with China last year was $295 billion. So out of our $600 billion trade deficit globally, half of it was with China. Intel actually has a trade surplus with China because all of those laptops and electronic products that you get from China, at least the laptops, have Intel chips in them. So Intel is fabbing those chips in New Mexico, Arizona, flying them to China. They're assembled in China into your Dell laptop or your HP or whatever you have, and then it comes back. So Intel, as a company, has a trade surplus with China, albeit the US does not. But anyhow, Intel has just opened this factory in China, which means that when the factory is up and running, Intel will not have a trade surplus with China. It will be making those chips in China, and so the US trade deficit with China will rise because Intel's surplus will fall off. Now, if I ask you, the audience, if I said to you, why do you think Intel's putting this plant in China? And if I said, well, it's because much less expensive labor in China, how many of you would agree with that? Raise your hand. I can't see very well. Anyhow, don't worry about it. Here's the point. There is no labor in a chip. It's like 1% of the cost of making a chip. It's all capital and technology. That plant that Intel put in China cost $8 billion. One factory to make those chips, $8 billion. That's where the cost is. Now, Intel has, as I said, enormous manufacturing facilities in Arizona and New Mexico. the low cost place to make those chips is New Mexico and Arizona. It's not cheaper to make them in China on an operating cost basis. You buy your supplies, hire your workers, pay your rent, pay your utilities. On an operating cost basis, New Mexico, Arizona, the low cost, high quality, high productivity location to make those chips. In econo-speak, if I were talking like an economist, I would say the United States has a comparative advantage in making Pentium chips. Let me just grab a drink of water here so I can go on for another 45 or 50 minutes, right? So theoretically, according to the rules of free trade, according to all the principles of the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund and all the econo-speak that you hear, the United States should be making those chips and exporting them to pay for the shoes and the textiles and the cars and the other stuff that we import. So why is Intel putting this factory in China? And there are 3 reasons. One of them is exchange rates. China's yuan is undervalued versus the dollar. Why is it undervalued versus the dollar? Because China wants it to be undervalued versus the dollar. And to be sure that it's undervalued versus the dollar, China buys about $1 billion in the international currency markets every day. That pushes the price of the dollar up and keeps the dollar strong against the yuan, which acts as an indirect subsidy for Chinese exports to the U.S. and as an indirect tariff on U.S. exports to China. So that's one factor. But honestly, in the case of Intel and the Pentium, that factor is really not very important. So forget that one. Second factor is very important, and it's this. Intel was thinking about building, they need to build more capacity to make these chips. And, Intel can put a plant in New Mexico, but they could put it in China, or they could put it in Europe or some other place. Anyhow, so the Chinese are aware. They know that Intel is thinking of building a new factory. How do they know that? Does anybody, if you go to the U.S. government, if you go to the U.S. Department of Commerce, for example, does anybody at the Department of Commerce know that Lenovo or Huawei or some other Chinese company is thinking of building a new plant? Well, I can tell you they don't. But the Chinese study this stuff. There's people in China who are looking around saying, where's Intel going to put a factory? So they go to Intel and they say, hey, why don't you put this factory in China? And Intel says, yeah, but look, our costs are less in New Mexico. And the Chinese say, let's see, how much would that factory cost? Oh, you say $8 billion? Well, suppose, let's see, we could give you the land free. We could give you a tax holiday for 25 years. We could give you utilities at half price. We could put up $1 billion as a capital grant. Would that help? Yeah, of course it helps, right? Yeah. So when you then do your financial analysis, from Intel's perspective, the investment is not $8 billion, it's more like $5.5 or $6 billion. So when you then do your discounted cash flow analysis, it turns out, and Paul Otellini, the CEO of Intel, will tell you this, it turns out that Intel saves about $100 million a year over its U.S. costs by putting that factory in China. Now, does the United States match that offer from China? No. And it doesn't match for 2 reasons. One is because actually the states of New Mexico and Arizona and other U.S. states do try to match. They'll offer some kind of revenue bond and they'll offer some tax break. But the states are playing with peanuts. They don't control federal taxation. The kind of thing they can play with is not that significant. At the federal level, the the United States does not engage in this investment attraction game. Many other countries do. France, Japan, China, Taiwan, Singapore. Singapore is a champion. Israel, Ireland. Many countries play this game. The United States does not play. So there's no competing offer from the United States. So this is a very important factor, but you know what? It's not the most important factor. Here's the big one. This is really the big factor. Every time an Intel executive, Paul Otellini, Craig Barrett, Andy Grove, every time an Intel executive goes to China, they meet a lot of Chinese leaders. And I mean, the head of Intel can easily see the president of China. No problem. So he starts with Hu Jintao, and then Wen Jiabao, and then they just go down the line. And then they meet, of course, with their own Intel staff in China. Wherever they go, all that they hear is Mr. Grove, Mr. Barrett, Mr. Otellini. When are you going to put a factory in China? Don't you understand? You have to demonstrate your commitment to China. You have to have a good image in China. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that, look, you got to put a factory here. You need to transfer technology here. And, you know, nobody ever says this directly, but there's an undertone message here. And the undertone message is, look, we're going to be a great power. We need to have this technology in China. And if you want to be part of the Chinese scene in the future, you better be sure that you supply this technology. And don't forget, this is not a democracy here. This is not a society of rule of law. Don't forget, Mr. CEO, you're not going to go to court against the Chinese government and win. And in fact, if you don't do this, well, you know, who knows what could happen. Now, for Intel, that's not a terrible threat right now, because nobody else can do what Intel does. Chinese can't go to Siemens or Fujitsu or Toshiba or anybody else, because nobody else makes these chips. But that is a significant enough pressure on Intel that I can tell you that was the most important reason why Intel's putting that factory in China, in order to maintain good relations with the Chinese government, in order to make points in Beijing. Now, another interesting aspect of the story is that when it was announced that Intel was planning to put factory in China, in the United States, how many of you saw the story? Anybody see it in the Wall Street Journal? One guy, okay, that's good. I'm impressed. That's good. Another guy, okay. Not many. It was a small story, back page of the Wall Street Journal. In China, front page, everywhere. And you know what? In the US, it was reported as if Intel's going to put a factory in China. Yeah, it's a factory. Big deal, right? In China, it was like, we just got MIT. Because they look upon that factory as like a university in terms of teaching, transferring technology, and moving China up the scale of value added. So what you have here is two entirely different philosophies of economic development and economic growth. And the Chinese philosophy, and it's not just China. In fact, this way of thinking, strategic industry development, strategic export-led growth, was pioneered in the 1950s by Japan. In fact, interesting aspect of this is that during the occupation, the American officials advised the Japanese that Japan should concentrate on labor-intensive production, textiles, shoes, things like that, because Japan had a lot of inexpensive labor. And according to Western American conventional economic thinking, countries are supposed to use the resources of which they have a lot and make products based on those resources and concentrate on that production and then import the rest. So the idea was, Japan, you got a lot of cheap labor, make labor-intensive production, sell shoes and textiles, and buy your cars and your machine tools and stuff like that, steel, et cetera, from us. But actually, John Foster Dulles was then Secretary of State, and he actually said, well, actually, Japan, don't try to sell stuff to us, because you Japanese couldn't possibly make anything that we Americans would want to buy. And so concentrate on selling it to Southeast Asia and those countries. Now, the vice minister of MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry in Japan, in the 1980s became a friend of mine. I was then in the Reagan administration. I was the chief US negotiator with Japan. And he once said to me, Clyde, he said, we listened to the occupation, but he said, we did the opposite. We did everything they told us, we did the opposite. He said, we made steel. We went for shipbuilding. We went for machinery. We went for semiconductors. We went for computers. And it worked. In 1964, The Economist magazine had a cover story announcing the Japanese miracle, Japan's economic miracle. So that was very impressive, and there was a guy in Singapore named Lee Kuan Yew, whose country had just become independent, desperately poor, and the biggest employer in Singapore at the time was the British Navy, with their big naval base in Singapore, but they announced they're closing it down just as Singapore became independent. So here's poor Lee Kuan Yew. He's, the country's born out of race riots. People are killing each other. Is desperately poor. He needs jobs. The Brits say, well, we're closing the naval base. Lee's looking around for what can I do, and he sees Japan. And he famously says, look east, meaning, hey, let's copy Japan. Not those Americans. They're too advanced for us. Let's copy Japan. Well, so he did. Today, Singapore's GDP per capita is higher than America's. The Koreans, sitting across the straits from the Japanese, they look across and, hey, anything the Japanese can do, we can do better. We're Koreans after all, right? Taiwanese, same thing. So everybody in Asia has copied this Japan model. So the big issue, and I'm going to close right now because I'm out of time, let me put it this way. It's kind of like when we think about our competition with Korea or with other Asian countries, it's kind of like this. We accuse them of cheating, being unfair. And they are in some respects, but it's more complicated than that. Because the premise of our accusations and the premise of the negotiations and the talks we have with them. Xi Jinping, the new Chinese president, was just in Washington this past week. President Obama said to him, all countries have to play by the same rules. We have these strategic, and I forget what we call it now, strategic economic dialogue with China. All of our cabinet members get together with the Chinese cabinet members and talk about economic development and so forth. We did this with Japan. We had the industrial policy dialogue. We had the strategic dialogue. We had a whole series of similar discussions with the Japanese. I remember once I was sitting in the White House, the Treasury Department, that's right, the Treasury Department had a new idea. Their idea was market-oriented, sector-specific. And so the idea was, some people, MOSS. Some people said it stood for more of the same old stuff. But anyhow, the idea was we're going to pick sectors where we know American production is competitive. Pharmaceuticals, telecommunications. And we're going to negotiate intensively at the highest level with Japan to remove all the barriers in those markets so that US producers can get into those markets and then branch out. And I remember I was sitting in the Roosevelt room of the White House, and I had the following thought. Here I am sitting at the center of power of the most powerful country the world has ever seen. I'm surrounded by sophisticated, highly educated, cosmopolitan men and women. The leaders of this great country. And I thought, if I stood up in this room and if I said, let's send missionaries to Japan to convert them to Christianity, they'd laugh at me. They'd laugh at me. But that's exactly what they're saying. They are proposing to send missionaries not for religion, but for our Adam Smith, David Ricardo, conventional orthodox economic philosophy to convert the Japanese to this economic philosophy. And they think that we can identify all the barriers in Japan. They think we can remove all the barriers in Japan. And they think the Japanese won't be able to think up new barriers once we get rid of the old ones. But they don't understand. Because what's really going on is we're playing two different games. Japanese then, Chinese today, they're playing football. They're not necessarily cheating. They're not clipping, they're not going offside, they're not roughing the passer. But football is a pretty rough game. You wear pads and helmets. We're playing tennis. We think the game is tennis, right? So we go to them, we say, no, guys, look, here's how you hold the racket, right? And then, somebody gets tackled. We say, oh, no, you're cheating. Thank you very much.